Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll give everybody a few minutes to join before we get started. And in the meantime, if you'd like to drop your name and your organization into the chat, it'd be fun to see who's joining us. And my colleague Megan is going to launch a quick poll so we know more about who is on the call. So if you can just answer, that would be great. Okay, I'm going to jump in. Welcome to this episode of our NextGen Now author conversation series. We're so glad that you could be here to join us and talk about themes from our book, Next Generation Evidence. I'm Tamar Bauer. I'm a co-editor of the book with Kelly Fitzsimmons and a senior advisor at Project Evident, whose mission is to harness the power of data, evidence, and technology to achieve greater impact. We believe that evidence is power, and we work to build power where it's most needed. Just a few words about Project Evident. It was launched in 2017 out of a sense of constructive dissatisfaction with the one study at a time approach, where funders and researchers drove research agendas on their own instead of collaborating with practitioners. We've now partnered with over 300 nonprofits, funders, researchers, and school districts to modernize, humanize, and scale how evidence is built and used. If you're interested in following along with our work, Megan is sharing a link in the chat to follow us on LinkedIn. As some of you know, this passion project traces its roots back to 2019 when we held a convening at the Brookings Institution, co-sponsored by the William T. Grant and Arnold Foundations. Around 100 stakeholders, with disproportionate representation from practitioners, gathered to discuss shared challenges and opportunities in the evidence space. As a result, we developed 5 principles of next generation evidence and wrote a book featuring short essays from over 80 authors that was published by Brookings in 2024. The 5 principles on the screen form the framework for the book, and they continue to guide our work today to strengthen the evidence ecosystem. Today, we're pleased to have 2 of our inspiring authors with us whose work really exemplifies these principles. I'm so honored to be joined by Ryan Martin, Deputy Director of the Center for Best Practices at the National Governors Association. Hello, Ryan. And Nisha Patel, philanthropic advisor in her own firm, Powered by Shakti. Hello, Nisha. We'd also love to hear from all of you. We'll have time for your questions, so drop them in the Q&A function at any time, and we'll be sure to get to you. Before I move right in, Megan, do we have results from the poll, or should we show it later? Megan will share it when there are enough results to tell us who's on the call. Okay, Ryan and Nisha, thank you for your evidence leadership, for your contributions to the book, and most importantly, for being here today with me. I'd like to invite each of you to share a few words about what brought you to the work. Oh, I'm sorry, before we start, Ryan, we have our poll so we can see there's highest representation from nonprofits, then researchers, and then funders, and then a little bit across all others. Thank you, guys. Okay, Ryan, let's start with you.
Sure.
What brought you to the work?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tamar. It's great to be with you and with everyone joining. Thanks for taking the time to hear from Nisha, and I'm looking forward to sharing a few things. So I studied economics in college, so got very interested in markets, how private markets work, how price and supply and demand intersect, and seeing all the fascinating things that happen when millions of people work independently in their own interests, and you see incredible things happen. I then did an internship in a state legislature, which was when I really realized that I wanted to work in policy because there was really good ideas on both sides. I really enjoyed like hearings, for example, where you would hear from folks and say, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea," and then you hear from someone on the other side and say, "Well, that's also a great idea." And so I thought, really difficult, try and solve these challenging problems, come together and put ideas together and see what works. And so I think as a result of that, I was studying anti-poverty programs in economics and realizing just some of the conflicting rules and incentives that made it difficult, especially in social, like safety net programs, that made it difficult, that sometimes had perverse incentives, discouraging people from work and earning more, and really got interested in the way that these things were developed and why they might not be better coordinated. So really, looking at programs designed to help people move up the economic ladder and realize that in a lot of cases, there wasn't much evidence. There was, in some cases they hadn't been studied, in other cases they had been studied and hadn't shown a result. And so I think, unfortunately, it made me realize that there was um, negative outcomes in some cases, either where an individual participated in a program that didn't help them in the way that we'd hoped, or negative for those who were paying for the program, where, taxpayers were funding services that weren't providing the benefits that they had hoped to provide to the people who needed it. So I think all those together really got me focused on wanting to do public policy and really evaluating and understanding the impact of programs and really getting the data we needed to see if they're effective.
Thank you. Nisha?
I think we didn't actually practice this, so there's an interesting parallel though, and I'm going to interpret, the work that some of what we're going to talk about today, the evidence building around the case for cash as one solution to address poverty in the U.S. And so the short version of my story is that I started grad school in August 1996, which it kind of blows my mind that that's almost 30 years ago, and it was basically the week Bill Clinton signed the welfare reform bill. And so being at that place at that time, like for so many people, very much shaped the trajectory of my career. And I went to graduate school in social work, studied social and economic development policy, but I had this dream of actually being a community organizer. And so I was fortunate to work with a grassroots organizing group alongside parents who at that time were receiving AFDC as it was transitioning to TANF. And folks may remember or may have read in history books, depending on how old they are, that each state had to develop their own plans to implement a block grant in their state, right? And so I was living in Missouri and I was spending a lot of time in the capital, Jefferson City, going to hearings, but supporting parents to testify to inform the development of policies in that state. And I am grateful every day for that experience because it gave me a really important lesson at the early stage of my career, which is that people whose lives are impacted by policy are often not at the table. Their voices are left out of the policy debates, yet they're the people that have the firsthand knowledge of what they truly need. And one of the things about cash is that in addition to economic security, it offers agency. It offers choices that don't come with programs like a childcare subsidy or a housing voucher or food stamps. Those policy solutions are important and helpful to household budgets, but guess what? If you talk to families and you actually listen, it becomes really clear pretty quickly that you can't use any of those other programs to pay for diapers, to put gas in the car to go to work, to pay for school shoes and supplies. And so when we talk about evidence, those voices of lived experience have to be central to the discussion, which I think we'll get into today. And there's this line from Shirley Chisholm that a lot of people like to quote. This line, if they don't give you a seat at a table, bring a folding chair, which is what parents have typically had to do when, parents and families whose lives are impacted. I have been really fortunate that at this point in my career, I've had seats at many tables, whether that is in the White House, whether that is in strategy meetings with Bill and Melinda Gates, whether that is at forums at the Aspen Institute. But I still carry that early experience with me, pushing for folks whose lives are impacted to have a voice and have a seat at that table. And so that means I still carry a folding chair. I carry those voices, I carry a folding chair so that I can still give up my seat to someone that doesn't have one whose voice needs to be heard. And I think maybe I'll end just by saying, interestingly, I'm very comfortable at the front of a room. Give me a mic. I love to rock a microphone, but I have learned through my work in philanthropy that you can also do a lot quietly from the back of the room. And maybe somebody else needs to be at that table using their voice.
Love it. Thank you both. Okay. Let's jump in. I'd like to start by inviting each of you to share a key message from your essay, a central idea. So Nisha, we'll start with you. In your essay, The Case for Cash, you write that the policy response to the pandemic built on the evidence from guaranteed income programs and strengthened the case for providing direct cash to children and their families who would otherwise struggle to make ends meet. Let's just level set before the conversation and start with the federal policy response during the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Time, it feels like a blur. It's hard to believe it's been a few years, but the audience probably remembers there were a host of responsive and time-limited policies that were put in place. But in terms of cash, I would lift up the most significant was the expanded child tax credit. So folks will remember ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, expanded the federal child tax credit for families with kids. And I made a few notes here so I get the numbers all right for the evidence people. So from July to December 2021, 90% of families with kids, so that's over 60 million children, almost all kids in the US, received monthly cash payments of up to $250 per child or $300 per child per month for kids under 6. And then at tax time, and families had choice, they could receive it monthly, they could receive it in lump sum, but could receive the second half of that lump sum tax refunds of up to $1,500 per child or $1,800 per child for kids under 6. So that's a lot of numbers. So to simplify, it was $3,000 per kiddo, or up to $3,000 to $3,600 per kid, right? That families could receive. And the impact was huge. This is like a very large data set that we have. In 2021, child poverty fell to 5.2%. That's the lowest rate that we have on record. And that was largely driven by the expanded child tax credit. So we cut child poverty almost in half compared to the prior year. So the prior year, child poverty was at 9.7%. So huge impact of, it was a time limited policy. We can talk more about maybe some of the implications of what we learned from that and what that means for future public policy.
Okay, super helpful. Thank you. All right, now let's look. I think it's just a good baseline level set. But looking at the landscape more broadly, can you lift up what you think are the most meaningful evidence headlines from cash programs around the country, and in the process, sort of give us your take on the case for cash? What do you think? Where are we now?
Yeah. So the book chapter, books take a while. And I was going back, I think I wrote that book chapter back in 2021 as the expanded child tax credit was being implemented. We didn't have all the evidence that we have now at that point. Since that time, there have been over 160 direct cash pilots in the US, and there's now a large body of this next generation evidence that the book is focused on. And there are a good number of states that have implemented their own state level and some local level child tax credit policies, as well as expanded or income tax credit policies. And some of the key areas where we're seeing positive outcomes across multiple of these direct cash studies, I'll just lift up a few of the themes. Decreasing financial hardship is one that's common across multiple studies. Decreasing food insecurity, increasing housing stability, improving mental health. So those are some broad themes. And then I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't lift up some of the latest really high quality evidence that we have from a program called RX Kids, which was published just earlier this month. And so for folks that may not be familiar, RX Kids is it's essentially a universal direct cash program focused on all newborn babies in Flint, Michigan. It was launched in 2024, and it's interesting because it's a public-private partnership. It's funded by a combination of TANF funds and private philanthropy. That's how you get to this universal eligibility. And expectant moms receive $1,500 during pregnancy, and then babies, once they're born, receive $500 a month for 6 to 12 months. It's now expanding to other communities across Michigan, and so it's scaling up pretty rapidly. And some of the recent findings that are really important they would highlight are in 3 areas. And so there are findings around 1, birth outcomes, 2, financial stability, which I mentioned before, and then 3, mental health, which has also come up across a number of direct cash studies. And so some of the stats that the researchers have found, so in terms of birth outcomes, what they found is an 18% drop in preterm births and a 27% reduction in low birth weight when compared to the previous year in Flint before the program was implemented and compared to similar cities in Michigan. So that's significant. And then about a 29% reduction in NICU admissions, so preventing hospitalizations for newborn babies. And then also generating healthcare savings, about $6 million in healthcare savings. So there's the direct impact on folks, and then there's also the impact on, potentially federal and state budgets and cost savings. And these outcomes were linked to behavioral changes during pregnancy. So things like reduced smoking and increased prenatal care. So that's birth outcomes, which we were talking before can be one of the most challenging things to try to move. And then second, financial stability. So one of the things they looked at was evictions. Evictions decreased by 91%. So that's huge. And then rent and mortgage debt decreased by $1,000 on average. So that's also significant for particularly for families with very low incomes. And then finally, mental health, postpartum depression, which we have now more recognition of, I think in the healthcare sector, in the literature, dropped by 14 percentage points. And in terms of the qualitative data, mothers reported being feeling more loved, more respected, more hopeful, and these are all indicators of enhanced well-being. So that's very, very recent research, and I think there'll be more to come as well.
So that's pretty dramatic. I was quite struck. Obviously, we talked about this before the call, just in preparing, and I had not heard of that program. It's super impressive, and I'm eager to follow along with them and see what they do. So if you were going to do the summary and sort of the what's your take, sort of the 2 sentences, where would you give us the 2 sentence summary? What's your take?
I would say, cash works for a variety of things. We've got clear evidence that it works in reducing financial hardship. We see that from the large scale data on child poverty reduction. And we've got very promising evidence that it can also impact a number of other outcomes. I think those are some areas for more study. Some of these early outcomes we're seeing around mental health, around birth outcomes. I would never want to say, it's a cure-all. There are no cure-alls. There's not some magic pill, but cash certainly is one of, I think, the most nimble policy solutions we have. It can potentially be one of the most efficient when you think about what it costs to implement a range of programs. So it also just makes a lot of sense. If the way we measure poverty in the US is largely by income, and if people don't have enough money, and if they have access to more cash, you move the poverty rate, right?
Thank you. That's super interesting. And I'm sure there'll be questions about it. People, drop your questions if you want to know more about any of those programs. We'll have a little time to talk about it more later. Okay, I'm going to jump to you, Ryan. In your essay, Building More Haystacks, Finding More Needles, you discuss the well-recognized challenges of achieving impact in social programs, as you refer to in your introduction, and you write, since many things won't work, should funding be ended until we find the right answer? Obviously, no. Instead, we need to fail with more certainty, more frequently, more cheaply, and much faster than ever before. I love that quote. Tell us more. What does that look like?
Sure, yeah. I think, and again, that's kind of blending my background interest in economics and markets and policy and saying, how do we innovate? How do we create and come up with ideas quickly and see what's successful? And I think, and for my background, that's that's in a private market, that's what a business does, right? They get really rapid feedback. So they have an idea, they launch it, their feedback is instant. I mean, it's revenue from sales, it's feedback from customers, it's competition from other businesses, fast, quick innovation and adaptation based on what's effective or not. And so the result is you move on from failure. Things fail all the time, right? Products don't work, they're adapted, they're changed, and that happens really quickly. There's a rigorous drive to really create something successful. And so, I was thinking of a few random examples, and I looked up yesterday, thanks to good old Copilot or Gemini or ChatGPT or whatever, that, there's been 52 iPhone models since 2007. And so, and there's been like bigger ones, smaller ones with different cameras and all kinds of different things, right? And it's just a constant iteration of coming up with what people are interested in. And sometimes they do well and sometimes they don't, right? So you see in the marketplace, because of the signals that are so readily apparent as a part of the process, that things adapt and evolve. And I think the challenge is that it's difficult in social programs to have that kind of data or feedback or things where you can adapt and change. And so I think, part of it is in a private market, there's great rewards to inventing a good product or a good service, right? Or punishment for a bad one, you could say, where it goes away. But so I think, kind of breaking apart that line, just kind of looking at, like failing with more certainty, that really is about committing to measuring programs and outcomes. We need to do that to know what's happening. In terms of more frequently, we just have to try a lot of things. Most things in medicines don't work. Most things in social services may not work. Most things in business won't work. And so you have to just have a lot of things that you're checking to see and understand what may or may not be effective. And then in terms of more cheaply, I think we're out of the era. You can't do a 10-year multi-million-dollar study of something to see if it's effective. You've really got to change where it's much less costly, you're using data that's available to you. You're able to use technology in the state, get agreements across agencies or with the federal government to be able to share information safely so that you can evaluate and see what's actually happening. And I think AI is going to be helping that. I think there's a drive to generally do better with the information that we have. And then in terms of failing faster, like we've just got to figure out how to operate with more real-time data.
Mhm.
With, who's coming into the program, what are their participation situation, why are they leaving? Is it good reasons, is it bad reasons, what's happening? So I think, just trying to increase that innovation cycle can help us more quickly identify things that may be effective and stop doing things that aren't.
So on that issue, further on in the chapter, you also call for funding and supporting continuous improvement to help program operators analyze what is working, what is not, and improve their practices as a result, saying that this would help create a climate where failure is acceptable and evidence building is prioritized. That sounds like a nice world. Can you give us some examples, positive or negative, from the essay or elsewhere?
Yeah. So two that I actually came across recently, just straight out of the newspaper. Just looking around that really jumped out to me as we were prepping for this and thinking about how they're applicable. One is a New York Times article back in September 8th that talks about Columbia University ending a institute they had on reading and writing. And I've got a couple lines. This is about K-12 education in literacy.
Mhm.
And there's a couple lines in here that really jumped out to me as an example of where I think we made a mistake. So it says, for 4 decades, Teachers College Reading and Writing Project um, produced curriculum that was, adopted by a wide range of people, but there was also fierce pushback. Critics said the program overlooked a large body of settled scientific evidence on how children become skilled readers. And so this institute has now closed, and the author of the article goes on to say, why did this happen? Since 2019, 42 states have passed laws requiring schools, or teacher training programs to use research-backed reading strategies. Critics, including some cognitive scientists and instructional experts, said the curriculum bypassed decades of settled research, often referred to as the science of reading. Some of the practices that were once favored, um, let's see, have been discredited. So this was 40 years of
Mhm.
teachers receiving a curriculum in teaching literacy that had fairly strong evidence that was not effective. Um, and I think that's an example of if we don't evaluate what we're doing and we don't require evidence on what we're doing, we can cause real harm. We can do things that aren't not only are not effective, but that actually cause challenges for those that we're trying to help. And I'm sure everyone involved in this is very much focused on helping children, right? And making a difference and making sure they can do these things. But it took this long, long time for people to shift toward a much more evidence-based approach. And I think it's just interesting that and again, this is the author implying this, but it's the idea that because states have now required evidence of these programs, it's shifted the curriculum toward things that are proven to work. The second one is actually from 2 days ago, also the New York Times, and this is about completely unrelated to social programs. This is about peanut allergies. So many of you may have seen this recently.
Yep.
Um, says food allergies in children dropped sharply in the years after new guidance encouraged parents to introduce infants to peanuts, as studies found. For decades, as food allergy rates climbed, experts recommended that parents avoid exposing their infants to common allergens. Landmark trial in 2015 found feeding peanuts to babies could cut their chances of developing an allergy by over 80%. In 2017, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases formally recommended the early introduction. And as a result, peanut allergies have been cut in almost half, and all food allergies have been cut by 1/3. So again, the focus has to be the outcome. I think in medicine, I think we're all fairly comfortable with, the sort of double-blind randomized trials. We want to make sure it's safe, all these sort of things. Sometimes when we veer into government services or social supports or education programs or workforce programs, we're a little more comfortable with the like, it's got to work, or we have to do something, right? Or some other kind of motivation. And I think it's great. Let's try it. Let's start. But we've got to evaluate these things to see what they're doing because we can cause real trauma or challenge or harm. Or in the best case, we can spend money that's not making a difference.
Thank you. Okay, that's great. I'm going to move on unless there are any, Nisha, any comments or anything either of you wanted to add to what the other said?
No, I read that peanut article and it really struck me too, as like, I wonder how does the word get out also about these things when there are studies? Because it's been
Absolutely.
a couple years, and I don't have young children, but I'm thinking about my niece who's 2 and her parents who are both have science brains, and I was fascinated that their pediatrician a couple of years ago actually was like, they do this micro dosing, like you put I don't know, they're these little packets that you put in the kids' milk that have these things, and I was like, what, isn't that dangerous? But I was not up on the latest research.
That's a
Yeah.
key point, though. You're right. Is like really, there's the translation mechanism, another thing that has to be in place as well, because you could have a great study somewhere that shows something works effectively, but if the word doesn't get out, no one else might change to that behavior.
All right, we're going to move on now to a question for you both. I put you together because you both share sort of extensive policy expertise and experience, along with a passion for harnessing the power of evidence for improved social outcomes. You're my people. I love this stuff. Given the overlap in your backgrounds, I'd like to explore how you think about the balance between research and action. How much research is needed before policy change or other action is warranted? Conceptually, practically, let's start, Nisha, with you with the case for cash. Are private funders defaulting to funding more studies, more pilots, when perhaps in your view, there's been enough knowledge for them to pivot to funding advocacy for change to adopt this kind of approach more broadly? Or is there enough divergence in the study findings to date to warrant more research? Should public funders act? How do you think about this?
Yeah, no, I definitely have a point of view about this, but and I'll give some nuance in my answer. And I should say like 90% of my work, these days is advising philanthropy, working with private donors. And my own view is, here's the nuance, it depends on the goal. There's enough evidence to move from, and to Ryan's point on the outcomes that we're measuring, there's enough evidence to move from pilots to policy change if the goal is to reduce poverty and financial hardship around cash. It's very clear that it does that. But there, pilots for different populations, different communities can also help still build political will with different constituencies where it may not be there. So, we would all like to think, oh, well, if we've got the evidence, then policymakers will just pass the policy. If that were true, it'd be a lot more simple. So political will does matter. And so, for example, again, we've talked about the evidence in the child tax credit in terms of some of the other direct cash experiments, guaranteed income programs around the country. Not all, but many of those have been in urban areas, in cities, and I do think it would help in terms of building political will to have more pilots in rural communities, more pilots in the South, which has been underinvested in terms of historically, like there's just been investment by philanthropy. It's been under-resourced. So I think that it can play an important role. As much as I might be convinced from the evidence, it doesn't mean everybody else is. So that's where, what's the purpose of a pilot? And the reality is people and policymakers need to see what works in their own communities, and they want to hear from their own constituents who are impacted by programs, right? We know that testimony from somebody in your district makes a big difference. You got to balance that with the body of evidence. That said, I do think there is still more worthwhile experimentation to be done with the impact of cash on some of these other outcomes that I mentioned before. Like, does giving people cash reduce poverty? Yes, because the way we measure poverty is based on income. But I think there's certainly, we're on the RX Kids is on the leading edge of it, but improving birth outcomes, reducing crime, reducing truancy, reducing child welfare involvement. So it's that, sort of age old, what works for whom under what circumstances to achieve what outcomes question. And all the outcomes I just mentioned, there actually are some cash pilots and programs that are looking at each of these outcomes. None of them are anywhere near the scale of the cash that families got with the child tax credit. And so, I think there's an argument for different additional pilots. But at some point, yeah, you do have to get to the question, what is enough evidence that you can then take it to policymakers and say, we've found this with private investment, some public investment, public-private partnership. We found this in one state, in a couple of states, in pretty diverse communities, enough to say that it's generalizable. We think this could work for a wide swath of the population. time to shift to public policy and government funding so that more people who can benefit from this service, this program, this intervention can get access.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Ryan, using the approach outlined in your essay to legislate the priority, not the program, how do you think about this issue of research versus action? Is there a minimum baseline of research demonstrating the programs have improved an outcome that you would want to see before you'd recommend legislating a priority and providing funding to eligible programs? How do you think about this?
Yeah, I've shifted my views, I think, over time on this. I think when I first went to I worked in Congress and the House and the Senate for 10 years. And initially I thought, we should have every law say, conduct a large multi-site randomized trial and let's get the data and then Congress can decide what to do. Well, that's a terrible idea. And here's why. What happens is then you have these really high stakes decisions where Congress is saying, Head Start, yes or no, right? SNAP, yes or no? Early childhood funding, yes or no? And that's just not the right venue to make the decision about, to review the research and say, should we do this or not? I'll never forget, I wish I could remember the details of this, but my boss and I, when we worked in the House, went over to, I think it was a GAO hosted meeting, and it was a bunch of research experts from agencies and things, and we shared something we were working, I can't remember. And there's this guy in the audience, and he's looking more and more sort of like distraught and sort of aghast. And so we finally get to the Q&A, and he raises his hand. He says, "How much training do these congressional staff and have in quantitative analytics and research methodologies?" And I was like, "Wow, like none, zero. They don't know anything
Right.
about any of that." And so it just made me realize that no, we don't want. It's not their role. Like they shouldn't be poring over these studies and deciding, what's the p-value here, and how did they come out in terms of the outcome compared to the control group. And so I shifted much more to the idea that, you know, this idea of legislate the priority, not the program. And even a few years ago, I think I'd be more in the vein of saying, well, we really need to study it a little bit, get a sense, do a pilot something, and then begin to do it. But I've shifted more, I think, more aggressively now to say, legislating the priority, you don't need research for that, but you need to be careful to define what the priority is. If it's more high school graduation, if it's less homelessness, if it's kids leaving foster care, you've got to be really careful in defining what that is, because that, in a way, is sort of your signal. That's your price, that's your outcome, that's your gold standard of what you're headed to. If you can get that right, I'm very comfortable with diving right in. If you have something that seems like it could be effective, you can make a logical case, you have a reason to believe it, it's safe. Try it out. Maybe try a couple things at once. But you have to evaluate and get the information. So again, that you can fail fast and say, wow, we thought doing this thing would make a difference. We're 6 months in, we're just not seeing it, so we're shifting. We're going to try something else. And so that's really where I got to the priority versus the program. A lot of Congress can be focused on pages and pages of shalls and shall nots, right? And Secretary may this and regulate these things. And it can get really quickly into the details, defining how you do something or the program you must use to do it. And I think getting away from that and saying, we can all agree that we want better, we want more people with jobs, and we can define what that is. There's a lot of bipartisan support, and you can legislate that and then create either an evidence clearinghouse or an agency like we did. We were able to build in pay for success type language in workforce programs, secondary education programs, home visiting programs, right? We created a $100 million fund at Treasury just to fund outcomes. And so there's a way to get, I think, more bipartisan agreement toward what the priority is versus fighting over what the program is. And also, when you get into the program, you get the politics involved. It becomes, who's lobbying who, or whose state is it in, or there's a testimonial that someone gave about how great it was for that person. And it just takes it away from really the focus on the end goal, which is the result. So I think, I worked on some legislation on the Hill where we created what we called tiered evidence programs. And this was the idea that you'd have a sort of initial phase that would be the kind of formulation of, can you make a theoretical case that this would make a difference? And maybe some funding for that level. Then you'd move on to a replication phase of, hey, it worked over here. Let's try it somewhere else, see if we can get the same results. And then finally, let's do an expansion, like you would with a good product. Hey, it's worked well. It's shown evidence in multiple places. It's time to roll it out. Let's franchise this thing. Let's get it going. Let's make sure other people are doing it as well. And so one good example that I've seen in this space is CUNY, so New York University System, the ASAP program.
Right.
And this is a program at two-year community colleges that was providing academic, financial, and some other supports to low-income students to increase graduation. And they adapted it as well for four-year colleges. But so they've done 3 randomized trials, and they've done one also at a four-year college. And all 4 of those showed statistically significant increases in graduation. As it was 11 to 15 percentage point gains in degree completion. And the Ohio study found significant increase in earnings after 8 years. So this is one now that you'll see is being replicated in multiple places. It's on a number of evidence lists as one that's proven. It's been done in so many different places. But that's a great example of something where they tinkered around, they fine-tuned it, they changed it a little bit for the four-year degree program. They still saw these outcomes, and now it's time to expand. Another funny example was I was at for National Governors Association. We get governors' policy directors together. And last week I was in Louisville, Kentucky with that group. And kind of a clear example well outside my world, but on legislating the priority and not the program. They had in January of 2024, they'd announced a 10-year infrastructure plan. So for those of you who may not know, Nashville is growing like faster than almost any city in the country. It's crazy. There's stories about people like ditching their rental cars and walking to the airport because the roads are bad. It's like it's pretty wild. But anyway, so they had this 10-year infrastructure plan about what they wanted to achieve, and the woman I was talking with said, about a year later, we had this company come to us called the Boring Company, and some of you may have heard of this before, and they said, we don't want you to pay anything, but we'd like to dig some tunnels, 30 feet underground, between the airport and downtown and other places, and it'll be completely privately funded. And we'll run a bunch of autonomous vehicles in it that people can hire and get around the city. Well, the city, their 10-year plan didn't have digging tunnels for robot cars in their 10-year plan, right? But they had a priority to figure out commuting and traffic and deal with this issue. And so what they did was, they're open to this because, again, they're outcome focused. And so they can now work with, these different organizations or others and be really creative because they're all focused on what the end result's going to be. And they might not know ahead of what the interventions might be that are effective. But the problem is if you start legislating the interventions, it gets tricky because things change, things evolve. You never know. It could be, flying robot taxis soon. I don't know. But they obviously might not have that in their 10-year plan. But as long as they have a plan with metrics of what they want to achieve, they can allow that innovation to come to them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. That's an interesting walk through legislating the priority. Nisha, I'm going to turn to you on another question that is, often talked about. How do you think about the role of philanthropy versus government when it comes to funding and support, specifically for practitioners' continuous improvement or the evidence building process?
Yeah, I have a couple examples. It's funny listening to Ryan talk about the ASAP program at CUNY. I was part of, I've worked for 2 different private funders that in the early days supported the expansion. So I was, which is where Tamar and I met, I was on the US Special Initiatives team at the Gates Foundation, and we launched the post-secondary success, what continues to be the team's post-secondary success strategy. We were an early funder of the ASAP expansion at CUNY, helping to bring it to Ohio. And then I also worked at the Robin Hood Foundation up in New York, which has funded that expansion in New York. But I'll give some different examples. And so, I think that the simple answer, the oversimplified answer of like, what's the role of philanthropy? What's the role of government is this frame around innovation versus scale. And I would say this too, and mean it. I do think that philanthropy is the innovation capital for the social sector. And very often the focus is on providing the seed or early stage capital to get to proof of concept. I've been involved in many initiatives like that on the philanthropic side. It's very much my personal sweet spot. I love it. If I were in venture capital, I'd be a seed stage investor. I love identifying and resourcing early innovators. And part of that resourcing needs to be for continuous improvement. And government's role very often is about scale. It's like we've been kind of talking about this theme. Once we know something works, whether it is an early childhood program, whether it's direct cash, how do we take it to scale so everyone who can benefit has access? But this is the part where I want to get my maracas and like shake this up a little bit, shake up the oversimplification. Because I would be remiss, especially right now, if I didn't remind our audience about the role of government in funding innovation. And so I wish I could see the audience. Like, how many folks have heard of DARPA? maybe like raise your hand. So DARPA, which is, an acronym for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Yes, I'm hearing at least a yes from some people. Okay, great. I love the audience participation. Let's have more of it. So this is an office of the Department of Defense that since 1958 has funded innovation. And I actually just pulled this from their website, so current information. Some of the examples that have resulted from public taxpayer funding, our money, right? It's all of our money. The internet, automated voice recognition and language translation, which is huge right now, right? The latest iPods. The GPS receiver in your phone, which is how many people get around during their day, right? The mRNA vaccine technology, which was used to be built upon as part of Operation Warp Speed, right, to roll out COVID vaccines. So government too can be an innovation player, even though it is largely a role for philanthropy. And then because I'm in conversation with you specifically, Tamar, I'm reminded of the story of how you and I met back when I was on that same U.S. Special Initiatives team back in 2008. Which most of our audience may not know. Maybe they weren't even working then. Maybe they were in college. And Tamara and I met each other. And this is the other side of the story, which is how philanthropy can be part of bringing programs to scale. So Tamara, when I was on the U.S. Special Initiatives team at the Gates Foundation, Tamara was heading up government relations for the Nurse Family Partnership. The foundation, we made a $10 million investment at the time in what was the Ed McConnell Clark Foundation's Growth Capital Aggregation Pilot, which if I remember correctly, you can check me tomorrow, had aggregated $50 million in private capital to help support NFP's expansion. So this was a private investment to support scaling to an extent, right? But it was really, I think, from where I sat, a leverage play. Because that investment supported NFP to work, and I want to give Tamar credit. She did a lot of the leadership on this to support a coalition to work with other home visiting programs to push for federal funding, based on evidence to get to what we now know as, I think it's a terrible acronym, but anyway, McV, right? The Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program. And check my numbers again tomorrow, but my memory is that initial federal taxpayer dollar investment was $8 billion. So that's exponential scale. It was money that came down through the ACA, right?
The initial investment was earlier, it was 1.6 billion, but that's okay.
That was 1.6.
That. Yep.
Yeah, it grew, right?
Yep.
And so that allowed.
Wait, Nisha, it subsequently grew partly because of the help from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, including the people that Ryan was working with. So we all actually worked together.
Look at that.
I hadn't thought about that there's a link between each of us. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, it takes many hands, right, to move something that big. And I think it's a clear example of the complementary roles that philanthropy and government can play in helping effective programs get to scale.
Anything to add on that, Ryan, from your perspective as more of the government person?
Yeah, I think, again, government in most cases is going to be the only one that has the firepower, right, to really push and expand these things. And I think, again, the idea of philanthropy helping to seed and, be the initial early stage investors and then finding the evidence and then pitching those up, I think is a great example that we should apply more of to make sure that we're finding those smaller things that are getting going with the innovators down there at the local level, and trying to figure out how to, help them scale up and do many more effective things across the country.
I didn't know the stuff about DARPA, Nisha. That was really interesting. I know who DARPA is, but I didn't know that those are some of the innovations that came from DARPA. So you did shake it up. You did.
Things that you use every day that's in your pocket. That's all in your phone now, right?
Super interesting. Okay. I love this. Ryan, I'm going to ask you a question about optimism and concern, large question, sort of looking up. What are you optimistic about regarding the use of evidence in social programs right now? And then if we can get to it, what is most concerning?
Yeah. I think, my hope is and my perception is that it's getting a little bit easier to collect and analyze data. And so I think the hope is that they'll be, again, finding more needles and more haystacks, right? Like the ability to really look at massive amounts of information. This is happening in healthcare with AI right now, right? Where it's sort of like, hey, we have these drug-resistant bacteria. Help me come up with new drugs that might help eliminate these things, right? And they set the computers loose and they find information, they start testing those things. And they've already been able to show a number of advances that are helping them short circuit what would normally be years long research. I think the same thing in social programs, where we've got a lot of information from a lot of programs in the past. We're collecting a lot of data that may not be analyzed or put together with other information that could shed light on what we're doing. And so I'm excited about the opportunities to do that. And I also think, too, more organizations, from my perspective at least, seem to be focusing on outcomes, whether it even be state legislatures passing laws like the article I mentioned about, requiring evidence. Colorado has infused a whole evidence process in their budgeting cycle. There's a number of other states that have done something similar. So I think that's really great. So I think there's sort of a push for that. And then also, hopefully the rewards to success are better as more philanthropy focuses funding toward things that demonstrate outcomes. Hopefully that will jumpstart more creative people coming together and putting up ideas and getting funding to do those things. So I think it's a slow process, but I'm really hopeful as I see those things coming together that we'll see more creative and innovative ideas that show impact.
And then what are you most concerned about?
For me, I think, there's given the way the world works, there's a lot of things we're doing that probably don't help. Some are innocuous and may not have any negative consequences, but there's a lot of things that you know, we're trying our best to help people in need in various social programs and other ways. And unfortunately, a lot of those may not make the difference that we hope they do. And so I think the concerning is that, in in the worst case, there's situations where there's been programs that we know are not effective or harmful that might still be running someplace under some name, right? That would be the worst case. But in the more sort of less severe case, there's a lot of money going into things that just may not be producing the outcomes that we're hoping. And I think the silver lining to that is there's a lot of funding that could be focused on improved versions of those things that could really make a big difference. So if you're able to do, even simple things like in a marketplace where you might do A/B testing, or like behavioral economics, like try red envelopes or blue envelopes or change the language or whatever, there's an opportunity to test while you're providing services and slowly kind of walk toward more effective things as you test different strategies. So you don't have to stop what you're doing and start something new. You can really just say, what are the features of these things that seem to be having the best impact, And that can come a lot of times from the individuals themselves receiving services. It can come from the caseworkers and others saying, what are we missing here? What's happening, And so I think as we're able to capture more of that innovation and on the ground expertise, hopefully there'll be an ability to switch what the interventions might be and make changes. This is where legislative priority comes in because you have to have the flexibility to be able to make some of those adjustments. And so I hope that as states and localities do have that flexibility, they can do more of that innovation.
Thank you. Nisha, any thoughts on that before we get to the final question?
I'm just two bubbles over my head. You're like, what am I optimistic about? What am I concerned about? I mean, I think optimistic, I am an optimist by nature. I will say the principles that were on that first slide that you put up at the beginning, I am optimistic that the world of evidence is opening up and taking a more holistic frame and really pushing to have more voices at the table, that it can't just be the researchers are important, but the folks who are impacted, the practitioners, the people whose lives are impacted have to be part of the conversation. The concern, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer. You can hear that if you're an SNL fan, the trombone, right? Like, but in the world of evidence, just like in this current moment, I think it would be remiss not to just, raise a red flag about we do have I won't single anybody out, but a critical mass of elected appointed public officials who seem to have an utter disregard for facts, for evidence, for science, and it's potentially endangering people's lives. And so that is a real concern. I am concerned about the gutting of public funding to agencies and cuts to research, to data collection, to evidence building, particularly NIH, the National Institutes of Health, life-saving research, Department of Education statistics. If we don't have the data, how will we know if things are continuing to work in the long run? So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to move on to one last question to you both before we get to questions. And I don't see questions from the audience. And so if you don't have them, we're just going to keep talking. There's a lot for us to talk about, but folks, if you want to ask, this would be the time. Okay. Ryan, can you identify one actionable step related to the work we've talked about today that you're passionate about, but that you believe is too often overlooked, either by funders or policymakers or researchers, something you're passionate about that's doable, an actionable step that just is not being picked up quickly enough and that you think that you're passionate about? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I mean,
And then Nisha, will go to you.
a couple, I mean, one sort of on a, somewhat obvious but hopeful is stop doing bad things. Like there's research showing some things don't work. Make sure that we're not doing that. I mean, there's a lot of clearinghouses on, I wrote down a few. There's a social programs that work. There's Straight Talk on Evidence. There's a group called Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development. And I can put some of these links in the chat too. There's a lot of organizations who are sort of analyzing and saying, another one is the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. That's like a quasi-legislative organization that is charged with kind of doing what they call a consumer reports review of like, is this good or not? And they look at the outcomes and the cost of the program. But I think in some cases, there's probably programs that are operating that we know don't have the impact that we'd hope, and they're still running. So that's a tough lift, I understand, because things are entrenched in a lot of cases. They're funded by certain organizations or states or things like that. I think an easier one is, sort of this A/B testing idea of if you have the ability to run an evaluation or implement a program, try a couple versions, say, we have a view, this one here, and like Nisha had mentioned, a lot of these cash programs, they try different amounts of income, right? Or provided all at once or over time. And so it's just an opportunity to get more bang for your buck when you're studying these things. Instead of putting everything on one intervention, try a few. And so I think you can hope that one might perform better than the other, and then you can do it again. And you can innovate and you can slowly walk toward a more effective program. Even if you can't completely replace something, you can still innovate, as we see again in the market, to get to a better outcome.
Thank you. Nisha?
Yeah, I think I want to come full circle to where we started in this conversation and where I started in my career, which is this community voice piece. And it's actually, this webinar reminded me to go back to those principles of next generation evidence that were up at the beginning. And one of those 5 principles is elevate community voice. It's too often overlooked. And I'll just actually wrote down like the principle, right? It was up on the screen at the beginning, but communities must have the power to shape and participate in the evidence building process to ensure that the data being shared and the services being provided are of value both to participants and to program improvement. It's like, what Ryan was saying about the private sector. I don't think the private sector is perfect, but you would never roll out a product you might, but without testing it with the consumers first, right? And getting that feedback to improve it. And it's like, why would we think in social policy if we just talk to the researchers and then we can design a program without like centering the people who we think and will benefit. And then we wonder why did no one show up? Like, why is there no take up of this? So that's, and I think, trying to end on an optimistic note. I am optimistic that things have gotten better. The fact that you've got an organization like Project Evident that's putting it out there as a principle, and you're starting to see more program design, policy design, include that aspect is a good thing.
I do think that one of the challenging things is to make it real. So there is some lip service paid to community voice, but increasingly, it seems to me from where I sit in my work with Project Evident that it's recognized as something that should be done in a meaningful way, in a way that really captures the actual views of people that are impacted by the work. So I'm heartened actually by the progress I see. It's not enough, but I am heartened by the progress that has been made.
Well, it's like, it's not free. So it does require some investment, right? Like you do have to compensate people for their time. You're asking for people's wisdom. Like, okay, like again, that's done in the private sector. We should do that in the, social sector, in the public sector as well.
Right, which actually, I'm just going to jump in. It's like, it's one of my pet peeves that, the continuous learning is also not free. Like if you want programs to continue improving, to use data, to develop the capacity to use data and evidence to improve outcomes, somebody has to pay for that. And it's often overlooked. And so that's I think something that we've talked about a couple of times during this conversation, and it's an important one from where I sit. But I think what I'm going to do now is we have a couple of questions from the room, and so let's take those. The first one I'm going to ask is, one challenge that I see, particularly in the K-12 education sector, is the focus on the continual cycle of structural versus substantive changes in learning interventions. Initiatives repackaged under a different banner that makes it murky to identify sound strategy. How do we stop this cycle? Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not an
Yeah.
education expert other than having kids who have been through high school and thinking about the 15 different login systems that they have, and all the different, I get texts to check my school emails, right? I mean, it's definitely a Wild West industry, I feel like, where there's people selling lots of different curricula and tools and other kinds of things. And so, um, I don't know if there's sort of a, consumer labeling requirements or some, it's hard to know what the different elements are. And, and like the commenter mentions about the sort of renaming or repackaging, it's a real challenge. I think the best we can hope for is transparency, and trying to make sure that information is available and publicized so that those who are interested can really understand kind of some of the ingredients. It's tricky because, again, I feel like there's in every social sphere, there's probably programs that have, not maybe gone well somewhere that are repackaged and then sold somewhere else as well. And so much of it is just the transparency and information sharing. But K-12 is a tough space because there's so many, teachers and principals and districts who are making these decisions. And so I think for me, a lot of these clearinghouses are really effective where they're sort of highlighting, like you're seeing from organizations like Arnold Ventures or others that are funding some of these evaluations, are highlighting ones that work effectively, but it's a tough one. I don't know if I have a great answer.
Yes,
Thank you. Nisha, any
similarly.
thoughts?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
similarly,
hard.
like I
Yeah.
would never put myself forward as a K through 12
Yeah.
expert, but maybe there's, a piece there thinking about like it is such a large system that impacts so many people. Like to Ryan's point on transparency, like, is there a way to get more direct to consumer information in a way that's usable, right? So you don't have to have a PhD in education to understand what this curriculum is about.
Well, a quick one that just jumped to mind, and again, I'm not an education expert, but what I understand education experts call the Mississippi Miracle, which is the reading uh,
Yeah.
in Mississippi. And this was outcome. Again, it was measure. It was, you know, we're going to track and see how it's going. And if kids aren't going to get there, we're going to hold them back a year until they know how to meet these basic benchmarks. And so in some cases, if you have the right metrics, um, you don't have the sort of the smoke and mirror that can happen with the curriculum of, oh, it's this and this. It's like, great, that sounds good. Well, let's see how it goes this year and we'll test. And so you can hopefully, thin out the marketplace by having a really good outcome measure.
Well, my understanding, and I'm by no means an expert on this stuff either, but in Mississippi, my understanding is that they used an evidence-based approach and fully funded the implementation of it. So it was like beautifully done and it changed outcomes.
And the other key, and I think Nisha will love this one too, is they trained people how to use it, right?
Yes, yes,
It was, how do you actually do this thing? It wasn't just use
yes.
this thing, read up on, figure it out. So they had people who knew what they were doing is key.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I meant by they really invested in the implementation. It wasn't just here's a book. They took it seriously. And
Right,
so
right.
which implies that if you have the resources, you take it seriously, you have an evidence-based strategy, it can work.
Mhm.
Outcomes can actually move. Nisha, anything else? I'm sorry, I think I might have.
No.
Okay, then there's another question that I'll read for the group, which is, when sharing evidence with state and local policymakers. This is more of a process question, sort of what agencies, what offices should be contacted? What aspects of evidence should be shared so that policymakers can implement and scale with fidelity? Okay, it's Ryan, do you want to start?
Nisha
Just
goes, I
because
mean,
this was your work. I mean, you
yeah,
both.
I mean, it depends. I think, you know, I helped organize and run over 24 hearings in the House. And I'll say, if you're sharing evidence at the national level with elected leaders, it's stories, 100%. It's got to be this person, this situation, here's what happened. I used to joke what I called the infomercial model, which is the example. Think of when you're watching an infomercial, right? The first thing, it's a cleaning product or something. It's black and white. It's someone with messy hair in a kitchen doing something that's not working, right? They get some new thing. It's fancy and shiny in color. Their hair looks amazing, right? Everything's good. A lot of times people don't know the status quo isn't working, or they don't understand. They think like, oh, well, I'm sure it's fine. They need a really relief to say, here's the problem now. This is where we're starting from. Because a lot of times if you come and say, oh, well, here's this thing we should do, and it's like this, they'll say, well, what's the big deal? Isn't that how it works now? Or like, aren't things fine? It's like, no, you have to say, this is the problem. This is how we're trying to make the change. So I would say, the stories, those are the things that elected leaders, at least at a higher level, are going to remember. Below that, obviously, you're going to want to have fairly clear, you know, uh, data and evidence to kind of paint the picture of here's what we saw and here's what we're finding.
Thank you, Ryan. Nisha, last word because we're at time.
Just really, I mean, the question was about state and local. So
Yeah.
part of it is just understanding that state and local elected legislators often don't have a Ryan, they don't have professional staff that has, studied the topic or been working in it for years. They're generalists and they're often part-time. The legislators are part-time. There's limited
Yeah.
staff, maybe part-time. So as much as you can make that person's job easier, like
Absolutely.
provide, the right level of information, short, pithy, with the data to back it up if they have time to read it.
And with that, we're at time or over time. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Nisha and Ryan for joining us. Thank you so much. This was fun. Today's event is part of an ongoing series of NextGen Now conversations. If you can fill out this survey that Megan has shared on the screen, we would appreciate it to inform future webinar topics. Our last webinar for the year will be with Kelly Fitzsimmons and Pete York, and our series will continue in January 2026. That's the first time I've said 2026. So thanks again, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you.